As I mentioned in the welcoming words, we have been exploring the theme of courage throughout the month of October. But what is courage, really? What is it made of? And where can we get some? Of course, that way of putting it makes it sound as if courage is something, some stuff or substance of commodity. Maybe we can get it from the wizard. It's not a thing that we can acquire in that way. And I want to talk this morning about what courage is, how it works. But I want to begin by honoring the Cowardly Lion. I think we can all relate to that character, right? We recognize in him some archetypal aspect or dimension of ourselves. Part of the reason that The Wizard of Oz is so perennially popular, I think, is that all of the characters represent aspects of ourselves, and we can identify with each one of them in turn. I've often used The Wizard of Oz as a classic example of what Joseph Campbell calls the hero's journey. According to Campbell, the hero, who could be male or female, sets out in response to a summons, an invitation, a compelling call to adventure, to use his words. Typically, the hero resists or refuses the call at first, but eventually consents, or in some cases, as with Dorothy, is swept away against their will. The adventure properly begins when the hero crosses a threshold into an extraordinary world, encountering both allies and obstacles on the way, meeting helpers and opponents as they travel along what Campbell calls the road of trials, in search of some treasure, some boon, Campbell calls it, some magical elixir that will allow them to return to the ordinary world with enlarged capacities to heal and transform. Of course, the ruby slippers serve that function in this story. Such a quest requires much of the heroic individual. It calls into play capacities of head and heart, of feeling and intelligence, as represented in The Wizard of Oz by the Tin Man and the Scarecrow. But courage seems to play a critically important role. It's one thing to have feelings and thoughts, it's quite another thing to act upon them, and that takes courage. Of course, The Wizard of Oz, although it's set in an imaginary outer or other world, it's really a story about an interior journey, an inner quest, an adventure into the depths of our own soul. So that's the first thing, the most important thing I want you to remember about courage. It's not something that has to be imported from elsewhere, from somewhere outside ourselves. Like Dorothy's home, it's in us all along. So what exactly is courage, and what would you do if you had it? The Jungian psychotherapist Jean Shinoda-Bolen points out that our word courage comes from the French word coeur, meaning heart. Courage, she says, is the willingness to act from the heart, to let your heart lead, not knowing what will be required of you next, or if you can do it. Courage is a matter of the heart. The heart in spiritual and symbolic terms is the seat of the will and the vital center of the integrated self or soul. Since classical antiquity, courage has been seen as one of the four cardinal virtues. That term cardinal comes from the Latin word cardo, which means hinge, like the hinge of a door. So all of the other elements of one's character, however complex, were thought to hinge upon these four cardinal virtues. The term cardo, by the way, is also used, was the name that was given to the main north-south street in any Roman city that was platted. There will be the main street. So everything was oriented, it hinged upon that cardo, that central street. Wonder what that would be in La Crosse. West? It's the north-south cardo, yeah, you might say that. We can certainly say that in this fellowship. It's our cardo. But so the four classical virtues are prudence, which is practical wisdom regarding the appropriate action at any given time, prudence, temperance, also known as self-control, restraint, or moderation, justice, also called fairness or righteousness, and finally, of course, there's courage, the ability to face fear, uncertainty, and threats with strength, resolve, and endurance. Later, the Christian church added to these four cardinal virtues the three so-called theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, resulting in 7 virtues, maybe not unlike our 7 principles, perhaps. They all work together, but courage, it seems, has a critically important role to play. You can't accomplish any of the others without it, really. As Maya Angelou put it in an interview with Krista Tippett, courage is the most important of all the virtues, because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. You can't be consistently fair or kind or generous or forgiving, any of those, without courage. The way I like to put it is, you don't have to be good to be brave, but you have to be brave to be good. Now, buckle up, because I'm going to get a little theological here for a minute or two. I meant to have a slide of the great German-American theologian Paul Tillich, who's considered by many to be one of the true intellectual giants of the 20th century. Tillich knew something about courage firsthand, having served as a chaplain in the frontline trenches of World War I, where the horrors of war traumatized and shattered and ultimately transformed his faith. He later played a leading role in resisting the rising fascism in Germany until he emigrated to America in 1933 after he had been fired from his university position by the Nazis. In his book entitled The Courage to Be, published in 1952, Tillich argued that courage is not just a moral and ethical category. It's not only a virtue, although it is that. It's not simply a psychological category, although that is true as well. Most importantly for Tillich, courage is an ontological category. Now that's a big word. Ontology is that branch of philosophy that studies being itself at the most fundamental level. Not the being of this, or not this being or that other being, but being as such. What does it mean for any being to be or not to be? That is the question that ontology asks. And it's the question that Tillich tries to relate to courage. In ontological terms, says Tillich, human courage is essentially the assertion of being over against the threat of non-being. At bottom, that's the essence of courage, the power to be in the face of non-being. Now, the ultimate threat of non-being, of course, is the threat of death. But there are many other instances, short of physical death, where the integrity of one's being can be threatened with disintegration. And in those instances, too, courage is called for. According to Tillich, then, courage is implicated in the very act of existing. It's woven into the fabric of being human. It comes with the territory, so to speak. It's courage all the way down, you might say, like the turtles I talked about in a story last month. There's nothing deeper or more basic or elemental than courage. There's nothing underneath it. Tillich would agree with Anne Herbert's observation, printed at the head of your order of service, that the sky begins at your feet. Think how brave you are just to walk around. Now, we ought to be encouraged by this. It means, first of all, that courage is not something that needs to be imported from elsewhere, from somewhere outside ourselves. It's inherent in our being. It's within us and all around us in extraordinary and ordinary ways. Now, most of my models of heroism growing up and courage were warriors, or courageous heroes were warriors. And war might be, as the philosopher William James said, the crucible of a certain kind of courage in its most primal and physical and fundamental form. But there are other forms of courage, of ordinary courage. I was talking with Milo yesterday, and he shared that in their movie night, the monthly Saturday afternoon movie series, they wanted a film that addressed the theme of courage. But it seemed that all of the films were war stories, and they wanted a kind of a family-friendly film, and they chose Babe, I think, which is a good example of a kind of ordinary courage. It's important to think about courage, but courage itself is never abstract or theoretical or theological, for that matter. Courage is always existential. I love the way in the children's story this morning that courage was described from the inside, how it feels from the inside. Like Jabari, we can measure and analyze the form and technique, but courage in the end is always an existential decision. It requires our active participation, our action. You simply have to jump or not. And sometimes not jumping is the courageous option. As was the case with Jabari, courage always proceeds through hesitation to decision and action. The brave soul continually asks, is this prudent? Is this wise? Aristotle understood courage as the golden mean between cowardice on the one hand and recklessness on the other. So the golden mean is somehow bringing together and integrating those qualities of soul. Courage always needs to be balanced and integrated with wisdom and prudence. We need to ask, what is the value to which our courageous act is committed? Remember, you don't have to be good to be brave, but you do have to be brave to be good. A while back during the summer, I was asked to officiate at a wedding at Gooseberry Falls State Park on the north shore of Lake Superior. And here's a little secret for you, a little secret tip from an insider having grown up there. The word is not gooseberry, but gooseberry. If you want to be thought of as a local next time you're up there, remember, it's gooseberry. That's what we call it, we locals call it. But it's been a while since I'd been there, so after the ceremony, before heading back to Duluth, I walked up the trail to the second falls, still dressed in my suit and tie. I walked along the trail to a point overlooking the pool where I used to go swimming as a kid when I grew up in Two Harbors. And there was a bronze plaque at the edge of the promontory commemorating the death of a teenager who had died when he hit some submerged rocks at the bottom of the 30-foot cliff, and declaring that swimming was no longer allowed. In fact, people do continue to swim there, and several young people, unfortunately, have died since then. When I was a teenager, jumping off the cliff was a rite of passage for adolescent boys. It wasn't exactly required, but everyone knew who had and who hadn't, and it played a role in establishing one's status in the social hierarchy. I didn't want to jump. I was afraid. You had to get the timing just right. Take off too soon and you wouldn't clear the rocks below. Get the timing wrong and you find yourself like that cartoon Wile E. Coyote suspended in midair in the void of non-being, so to speak. But eventually succumbing to peer pressure, I did jump. Now, not just recently after the wedding, but back when I was a teenager. And I still remember the feeling as I launched and landed well beyond the rocks, plunging into the very deep, cool water. When I surfaced, a friend of mine had come up behind me in the water. I didn't know he was there, so when I turned and saw him, I was startled, and I blurted out something that showed that I was scared. And when I realized that I had exposed my fear in that way, I tried to magically bend the words as they were still coming out of my mouth to make them sound like a shout of triumph rather than what they really were, a confession of sheer terror. Now, courage is not the absence of fear, but the recognition that something is at stake that is more important than your fear. So what value was at stake here? I wasn't jumping in to rescue a drowning child. I was leaping to preserve my place, to be accepted, to belong. Was that courage? Perhaps. Remember, you don't have to be good to be brave. You don't even necessarily have to be smart. Although Aristotle would say you do need to integrate it with the wisdom, of course. What was lacking for me in this decision were the cardinal virtues of prudence, practical wisdom, and temperance, perhaps. I was afraid, but I didn't want to show my fear, to expose my vulnerability, to risk being seen. In terms of the Milarepa story, I really identified more with the monster, not the enlightened sage. I didn't want my own fears and vulnerabilities to be known, to be seen. The Milarepa story reminds me of Rainer Maria Rilke's wistful wondering in his beautiful letters to a young poet. Perhaps, says Rilke, all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. Well, perhaps. But a lot goes into that acting with beauty and courage, and that requires ongoing spiritual practice. The Milarepa story also reminds me of a little parable that Jesus told, recorded in the Gospel according to Luke. It's uncannily similar, actually. He says, when the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, said Jesus, it wanders through waterless regions, looking for a resting place, but not finding any. It says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds the house swept and put in order. And then it goes and brings 7 other spirits more evil than itself. And they enter and live there. And the first and the last state of that person is worse than the first. So here, Jesus, the village psychiatrist, as I've called him, is criticizing a certain kind of Puritan zeal that seeks to purge and purify the psyche of all its demons and shadows. Jesus is describing a psychological phenomenon that was later labeled by Freud the return of the repressed. You can't just forcibly expel those aspects of yourself that you don't like, those that we consider alien. They will come back with a vengeance. Instead, I like what the Buddhists say, we need to take tea with our demons, to just have a little sip of tea, invite them in, get to know them, but don't, and feed them, they say. But what you feed your inner demons is 1 grain of rice. If you starve them, you'll only enrage them, but you don't want to feed them a 3-course meal. Just give them a grain of rice. But that's the way to live with your inner demons. So, what kind of courage does it take to be a Unitarian Universalist today? Courage is not explicitly named as one of our 7 principles, but it is, I think, a necessary presupposition for all of them. To affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person, for example, requires courage. To work for justice, equity, and compassion requires courage. I remember when I first met Diane, 18 years ago now? Something like that. She had a bumper sticker on the back of her car that said, "Speak up, even though your voice shakes. And that was attributed to Maggie Kuhn, the founder of the Gray Panthers. Speak up, even though your voice shakes. And that's how sometimes I think that it's only when our voice shakes that we're really getting close to the truth. When we stutter and stammer and can't quite get it out, that's a sign that we're on to, that something is close. Tillich distinguishes helpfully, I think, between fear and anxiety. Fear has an object. Anxiety doesn't. Fear is like fear of lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. Anxiety is generalized. It's different. It's more difficult to deal with courageously because there's no object to focus on. Getting out of bed in the morning may be all that's manageable in the face of that kind of anxiety. But part of soul work, I think, is transforming anxiety into more manageable fears. That's what Milarepa was doing for years as he made his journeys. A contemporary Canadian Buddhist teacher, Pema Chodron, advises her students, go to the places that scare you. And many of those places may be inside. The Cowardly Lion was even afraid of his own imaginary sheep. Robert Frost, in another little poem, says, they cannot scare me with their distant spaces on stars where no human race is. I have it within me so much closer home to scare myself with my own desert places. So we have those desert places within ourselves. One thing that Tillich doesn't say is that facing your fears and anxieties and acting with courage will change you. It will enlarge the scope of your own soul. We must have the courage not only to be, which Tillich said, but to become, to change, to be transformed as we engage the world with our brave and vulnerable hearts. Eleanor Roosevelt famously said, you gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face. You are not able to say to yourself, I have lived through this horror. I can take the next thing that comes along. She too says, you must do the thing you think you cannot do. What a wonderful spiritual exercise to take home with you. Take some time to be honest with yourself about what scares you. Perhaps journal about it. Inquire into those fears with wisdom and prudence and with a genuine curiosity. Practice ordinary courage. I like to think of them as micro assertions. We've heard about we try to avoid microaggressions, but ordinary courage is a matter of micro assertion, little steps of bravery, little brave steps in the face of things that we fear. So courage is a practical skill. As Brené Brown puts it, you learn to swim by swimming. You learn courage by couraging. And I would add, by encouraging. To encourage means to give heart, to impart strength and confidence to others. It has always been the work of religious community, and specifically in its worship life, to strengthen and encourage. Think of that line from the old Christian hymn, grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the facing of this hour. For the facing of this hour. We need that kind of courage. That is our work as a religious community, to encourage one another, to give one another the confidence and heart to live as fully as possible. I leave you with these words from the Reverend Bob Doss, who is now deceased, was for many years the minister in Wilmington, Delaware, UU. He says, for all who are seeking God, may the Holy One go with you. For all who embrace life, may life return your affection. For all who seek a righteous path, May the way appear to you and the courage to take it step by step.